The radio cracked with a voice that didn't sound human anymore. Any jet, please, we are being overrun. Danger close, repeat, danger close. Lieutenant Commander Reyes was face down in a dry riverbed in eastern Afghanistan. His thigh open from a 7.62 round. 3 of his SEAL teammates pinned behind a crumbling mud wall. And the Taliban fighters who had ambushed them were now close enough that he could hear the metal click of their reloads between bursts. He had called for fast movers, anything with wings and ordnance, anything that could buy them 90 more seconds of life. What he expected was an F-16 streaking across the sky at 30,000 feet, a distant savior dropping a guided bomb from somewhere safe. What he heard instead was a low, grinding, almost prehistoric growl, the kind of sound that vibrates inside a man's teeth before his ears even catch up. And then the voice on the radio came back, calm, female, almost gentle. Trident 6, this is Hog 1-1. I'm rolling in from your west, low and slow. Keep your heads down, sir. Mama's home. Reyes lifted his head 1 inch from the dust, and what he saw made him forget the bullet in his leg. The question is, would you have trusted that voice with your life? Stay until the end, because what she did next rewrote everything that room of generals thought they knew. Captain Elena Birdie Vance was not supposed to be the pilot anyone called for the impossible. She had grown up in a single-wide trailer outside Pueblo, Colorado. The daughter of a Vietnam-era crew chief who could fix anything with an engine and a mother who waited tables at a diner that served truckers off Interstate 25. From the time she was 6 years old, she had watched her father stand in their gravel driveway every afternoon at exactly 4:15, a cup of black coffee in his hand. His eyes turned upward as the A-10 Thunderbolts from the nearby Air National Guard base came home in a slow, deliberate procession. He never said much, but once, when she was 9, he put his hand on her shoulder and told her that the men flying those ugly, magnificent jets were the only ones who would come down low enough to see the faces of the soldiers they were saving. That sentence stayed inside her like a seed. She was not a natural athlete, and she was not the brightest student in her class, but she had her father's stubbornness, the kind that came from grease under fingernails and eviction notices and pride in things that worked. She got into the Air Force Academy on her 3rd application, finally accepted because of an essay she wrote about the day a tornado tore through her town and a National Guard helicopter pilot landed in a Walmart parking lot to evacuate her grandmother. At the academy, she was small, quiet, and underestimated. Upperclassmen called her Birdie because she was barely 5'4" and looked like something that could be blown away in a strong wind. The nickname stuck, but slowly the meaning of it changed, because by her junior year, she was outflying classmates twice her size in the T-6 trainers, holding G-loads that made grown men gray out, and reading flight manuals at 3 in the morning with a flashlight under her blanket. When she was finally selected for fighter track, she did not celebrate. She drove 8 hours home, walked into her father's garage where he was bent over the carburetor of a 1972 Ford pickup, and told him she had been picked. He did not look up, but his hands stopped moving. After a long moment, he said, "Only, you make sure you fly low enough to see them, Birdie. You promise me that." She promised, and she meant it. That promise would follow her through every sortie she ever flew, through every check ride, through every long night in a darkened ready room. And eventually, it would follow her into a dry riverbed in Afghanistan where 4 men were about to die without knowing her name. The road from that promise to the cockpit of an A-10 Warthog was longer and lonelier than anyone outside the community could understand. After commissioning, Vance was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas for Euro-NATO joint jet pilot training, where she logged her first hours in the T-38 Talon, a sleek, unforgiving needle of an aircraft that punished hesitation. She was one of 3 women in a class of 42, and she learned quickly that being noticed was a tax she would have to pay every single day. She arrived first, left last, ate alone when she had to, and never once let her instructors see her cry. Even after the day, she watched a classmate eject from a malfunctioning trainer and walk away with a broken back and a career ending in slow motion. When the assignment board came down at the end of the program, she did something almost no one in her class understood. She had the scores to pick the F-15E, the F-16, even a slot in the embryonic F-15 35 pipeline. Instead, she wrote, in her own neat handwriting, A-10 Thunderbolt 2 as her first, second, and third choice. Her instructors pulled her aside and asked if she was sure. The hog, they reminded her, was old, slow, ugly, often described as a flying titanium bathtub bolted to a 30mm Gatling gun. It was not the path to flag rank. It was not the path to glamour. It was the path to mud, to forward operating bases with no running water, to flying low enough to take small arms fire in the wing. She told them that was exactly the point. She reported to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson for the A-10 formal training unit, and there she met the airframe she had been dreaming about since she was 9 years old. The first time she ran her hand along the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon longer than a Volkswagen Beetle, she felt a strange kind of homecoming. The A-10 was not a fighter in the traditional sense. It was a flying promise to the men and women on the ground, a machine designed in the 1970s around a single, unglamorous mission, which was to come down low, slow, and close, and to kill whatever was killing American troops. Her instructors were grizzled majors and lieutenant colonels who had flown over Kuwait, Bosnia, and the early years of Iraq, and they did not soften anything for her. They taught her how to read terrain at 400 knots, how to feel the difference between a rocket-propelled grenade launch and a muzzle flash, how to talk on 3 radios while pulling 6GS, and how to never, ever leave a friendly call sign hanging in the wind. By the time she pinned on her wings as a combat mission-ready A-10 pilot, she had stopped thinking of the jet as something she flew. She had started thinking of it as something she wore. Her first deployment came 2 years later to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, attached to the 74th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron. The Afghanistan she landed in was not the Afghanistan of the early war. It was a tired country, a tired mission, and a tired American footprint of small outposts strung along valleys where the Taliban had begun to push back hard. She flew her first combat sortie on a Tuesday in late summer, providing overwatch for a convoy moving through the Tagab Valley. Nothing happened. She came home, debriefed, ate cold pasta in the chow hall, and sat on the edge of her cot for a long time, trying to understand why her hands were still shaking. By her 20th sortie, they had stopped shaking. By her 40th, she had dropped her first bomb in anger, a 500-pound GBU-38 onto a compound from which Marines were taking sustained fire. By her 60th, she had fired the gun, the great rolling BRRRT that sounded, from inside the cockpit, less like a weapon and more like the earth tearing in half. She learned things in those months that no manual taught. She learned that the voices on the radio of pinned-down infantrymen had a specific timbre, a tightness behind the words that meant the difference between a unit under pressure and a unit about to be wiped out. She learned to hear that timbre and respond to it before the words caught up. She learned the names of ground controllers she had never met and never would meet, men whose voices she would recognize for the rest of her life. She also learned grief. On a cold morning in October, she lost her wingman, Captain Marcus Stitch Holloway, to a freak mechanical failure on takeoff. He was 28, married, and his wife was 6 months pregnant. She flew his memorial flyover 3 days later, the missing man formation pulling up into a clear blue sky. And when she landed, she walked straight to the squadron chapel and sat on the floor for 2 hours without saying a word. Her commander, a colonel named Briggs who had flown hogs over Mosul, found her there. He did not tell her it would be okay. He told her, instead, that the only thing worse than losing a brother in this airframe was losing the next one because grief made your hands slow. He told her she had to choose, that night, whether she was going to fly the rest of her tour with Marcus or in spite of him. She chose with him. She flew her remaining sorties with Stitch's call sign written in black marker on the inside of her left glove, where only she could see it. Her gun camera footage from that deployment was eventually used to train the next generation of A-10 pilots. Her commanders began to notice that when troops in contact called for close air support and Birdie was on station, the call almost always ended with the ground controller saying the same 3 words on the radio. Cleared hot. Thanks, ma'am. By her 3rd deployment, she was a flight lead, then a mission commander, and finally, at the age of 31, the operations officer of an A-10 squadron forward deployed to a dusty airstrip near Jalalabad. The mission tempo had shifted again. Special operations elements were running deep reconnaissance into valleys the conventional forces had pulled out of years before, and when those teams got into trouble, the trouble was usually catastrophic. She was the one who briefed every alert pilot, every morning, on the locations of friendly teams whose presence officially did not exist. She kept a paper map in her flight suit pocket, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn through. With grease pencil marks, she updated by hand each night. On the night before the riverbed, she had not slept well. A new SEAL element had pushed into a valley her squadron had been watching for weeks, a place where the terrain funneled patrols into a single dry wash with high walls on both sides. The kind of geography that made every pilot in her squadron uneasy. She had told the Joint Operations Center that her squadron would keep 2 A-10s on cockpit alert all night, fueled, armed, and with pilots strapped in case the team needed help. The JOC had pushed back, citing crew rest rules and aircraft maintenance cycles. She had pushed harder. She had won, barely. At 3:47 in the morning local time, the alert klaxon went off. She was already in the cockpit. Her wingman, a young captain named Diaz on his first deployment, was in the jet beside her. The launch order came through her headset in fragments, the kind of fragments that meant the people on the other end did not have time to give her a clean briefing. Troops in contact, danger close, for friendlies, multiple wounded, estimated 40 to 60 enemy, closing. She read back the coordinates, ran her hands across the master arm switch, and pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 lumbered down the runway, and as the wheels left the ground, she did something she had done before every combat sortie since her first deployment. She touched the inside of her left glove, where Stitch's call sign was still written, faded but visible, in black marker. She climbed to altitude, checked in with the controller, and listened to the voice of the man on the ground. Lieutenant Commander Reyes did not sound like a SEAL. He sounded like a man who had already done the math and knew the answer. She heard the timbre. She knew it. She pushed her nose over and dropped down through the layers of cold mountain air, her wingman tucked tight on her right wing, until the valley walls rose up on either side of her, and she was flying. Deliberately, below the ridgelines. She could see the muzzle flashes before she could see the men. What happened in the next 11 minutes would later be reconstructed from radio traffic, gun camera footage, and the testimony of 4 men who would walk away from a place they had not expected to leave. She came in from the west, exactly as she had told Reyes she would, low enough that the SEALs on the ground could see the grin of the painted shark teeth on the nose of her aircraft. The first pass was the gun. She lined up on the south side of the wash, where the heaviest concentration of fighters was massing for what would have been a final assault, and she squeezed the trigger for 1.5 seconds. The GAU-8 fired 390 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium in that time, and the south wall of the wash simply ceased to be a threat. She pulled off, banked hard left, took fire in her right wing from a position she had not seen, and called it out to Diaz, who rolled in behind her and silenced it with a Maverick missile. She came around again. Reyes was on the radio now, his voice steadier, calling targets with the precision of a man who had decided he was going to live after all. She listened. She did exactly what he asked. 3 more gun runs, 2 more Mavericks from Diaz, and a single 500-pound bomb walked into a compound at the head of the valley from which a heavy machine gun had been raking the SEAL's position. Between passes, she stayed low. She did not climb to safe altitude. She kept the jet visible, kept the sound of the engines pressing down on the valley like a hand, because she knew, from 3 deployments of hard-won experience, that the psychological weight of a warthog at 200 feet was sometimes worth more than the ordnance it carried. Enemy fighters who would happily charge a position under artillery would break and run when a hog came down the valley at them. They broke. They ran. By the time the medevac helicopters arrived, the wash was quiet, the SEALs were consolidated, and Reyes was sitting up against the mud wall with a tourniquet on his thigh and a strange expression on his face. She made one final pass, low and slow, rocking her wings once over the position. Then she climbed out, joined on Diaz, and pointed the nose home. Her right wing had 17 bullet holes in it. Her hydraulic pressure was low. Her fuel was lower. She landed at Jalalabad with 800 pounds of gas remaining, taxied to the ramp, shut down the engines. and sat in the cockpit for a full 2 minutes before she could make her hands unbuckle the harness. Her crew chief climbed up the ladder, looked at her face, and said nothing. He just nodded. That was the language of the community. A nod was a cathedral. The story of what she did in that valley traveled, the way stories in the special operations world travel. By word of mouth and quiet phone calls and after-action reports stamped in ways that made them hard to read. She received a distinguished flying cross with valor in a small ceremony at Bagram, attended by her squadron and by 4 men in civilian clothes who did not give their last names, but who stood at attention in the back of the room throughout the entire reading of the citation. Lieutenant Commander Reyes was one of them. He had walked into that ceremony on a cane, his thigh still healing, and afterward he found her at the edge of the flight line. He told her he had spent the last 3 months trying to figure out what to say to the pilot who had come for him. He told her that when he had keyed his radio that night and begged for any jet, he had been picturing something very different, and that when he heard her voice and saw her aircraft come down into that valley, he had felt, for the first time in his career, what it meant to be on the receiving end of the promise the A-10 community had been making to people like him for 40 years. She did not know what to say, so she told him about her father, and about a gravel driveway in Pueblo, Colorado, and about a promise made by a 9-year-old girl to fly low enough to see the faces of the men she was saving. He listened, and when she was finished, he reached into his pocket and handed her a small object. It was the brass casing of a 7.62 round, the one the surgeons had pulled out of his thigh. He had drilled a small hole in the top and put it on a leather cord. He told her that he wanted her to have it, because she had earned it more than he had. She wore it under her flight suit for the rest of her career. She went on to command a squadron, then a group, and she became one of the most respected close air support instructors in the Air Force, teaching young pilots not just how to fly the hog, but how to listen for the timbre, how to read the unsaid thing under the words on the radio, how to come down low when every instinct and every regulation told them to stay high. She told her students, every single class, that the hog was not a jet. The hog was a covenant. The covenant said that there was no such thing as too low, no such thing as too close, no such thing as too dangerous. When the voice on the other end of the radio was the voice of someone who believed they were about to die. She told them that the A-10 had been called many things by people who had never flown it: ugly, obsolete, ridiculous, and that none of those people had ever been pinned down in a riverbed at 3 in the morning. She told them that the men on the ground knew the truth. The men on the ground had always known the truth. And she told them, finally, the thing her father had told her on a gravel driveway when she was 9 years old. The thing she had carried through every cockpit and every deployment and every memorial flyover and every quiet morning when the names of the dead came back to her without warning. You fly low enough to see them. You promised me that. Captain Elena Vance retired as a colonel after 26 years of service, with 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq, and a quiet shelf in her home office filled with awards she rarely talked about and photographs she looked at often. The brass casing on the leather cord still hangs in her closet, on the same hook as her flight suit. Lieutenant Commander Reyes invited her to his daughter's christening, and his daughter's middle name is Elena. The 3 other SEALs from that riverbed are still alive, still serving, or recently retired, and they know exactly which pilot to thank when the bill for their lives finally comes due. Her story is not famous. It will not be made into a movie. There are dozens of pilots like her in the A-10 community whose names will never be in a headline, whose gun camera footage will only ever be seen by other pilots, and whose greatest moments will live only in the memories of the men they saved and the families those men came home to. That is the way she would have wanted it. The lesson of her life is not about glory. It is about the weight of a promise made by a 9-year-old girl in a gravel driveway, and the discipline it took to keep that promise across decades of training, sacrifice, grief, and fear. It is about the choice every leader eventually has to make between safe altitude and the people on the ground. It is about flying low enough to see them, even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know. The voice on the radio that night begged for any jet. What arrived was something more than a jet. What arrived was a covenant in flight, an ugly, beautiful, unshakable promise, kept by a small woman from Pueblo who had decided, a very long time ago, that some words mean what they say.